I'm glad that we ended the conversation talking about stories and narratives, because that's exactly what we're going to get into now, the power of storytelling. Usually a good story can inspire you, call you to action, motivate you, all those wonderful things. And I'm going to have my boss, our program manager for the Climate Speakers Network, is going to come now and talk to you all about the power of storytelling. How to use the story you heard today, whether it's from Anita or Miss Flowers, a story you're going to hear next week, or something you heard on the Trevor Noah show 2 weeks ago, to use that story and to use it for change and to call people to action. So I'm going to let Jill come up and share her time with you all.
All right, so this section actually has kind of a couple different purposes. So one is we are going to talk about effective storytelling and how you can tell effective stories, but you're only going to have to listen to me talk for probably like 10 minutes, maybe less. But then I'm actually going to pass it off to all of you, because the other important aspect here is really where all of you fit in this greater story. So in order to be a good activist, in order to be able to communicate with others, it's important for you to be able to explain your reason for being a part of all of this. And also, all of you in this room have your own stories to tell and your own powerful reasons for being, wanting to be part of this movement and wanting to share with others. And so, as my first kind of slide here says, stories really are our power. We can use stories in so many different ways, whether that be when it comes to organizing or just talking to a friend or a family member, or if it's when you're giving a presentation. So as both of you saw with Anita and Catherine up here today, they told you stories, and that's why everybody in this room was engaged. Neither one of them was just kind of going through facts and statistics and charts. They were really telling you their own personal stories and stories of people that they know. And that's going to be a lot more powerful way to talk about all different topics, but especially topics like environmental justice and climate change, which can be very challenging to communicate. So a lot of times, as I'm sure most of you know, that came up a little too quick, but that's okay, climate change has historically really been talked about as being a climate issue, right? Historically, we have not really portrayed climate change as it relates to every other issue out there. But climate change really does relate to everything else. Climate change can be talked about in relation to health, food, moral, almost any issue that you can think about occurring today can be related back to climate change. And the same when it comes to climate solutions. So climate solutions just aren't, putting solar panels on a house. They're also opportunities when it comes to the future. So they're power building opportunities, employment, as we were discussing already, opportunities, energy, resilience. So the reason we have these two slides is that I really want everybody to start getting in this kind of mind frame that when you're talking about climate, climate change, it doesn't just have to be about the environment. It just doesn't have to be somebody that's majoring in environmental science or a hard science that can really get involved in this conversation, because it ties into so many different things. So telling your story, why do we use stories? So storytelling really is the essential human activity. We all use stories in our daily activities. And why do we use stories? Because stories help us connect. So one of the big things stories help us prevent is what we call the curse of knowledge. And so the best example of this, I think, is, so all of you are in college pretty much right now. How many of you know a professor who is insanely smart, but they stand up at the front of the room and you have no idea what they're talking about, right? So that's what we call the curse of knowledge. That happens a lot in the climate change sphere. People that know all about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, they can spout off all these statistics, but they're going to lose people very quickly because the person they're talking to is just not going to understand or relate to those facts. Another great thing about stories is they help you to build relationships and connect with people with shared values. And so stories naturally create a back and forth with the person that you're communicating with. So you're going to learn more about them and can connect to things that the person you're talking to really cares about. Another nice thing about stories is that, in theory, they can't be wrong. So if you're telling somebody your personal story, they can't bring up a statistic or a fact from some obscure news source that says what you're saying is wrong. If you're talking about something that happened in your own backyard, that happened in your own backyard. There's no way they can argue that with you. But the other thing about stories is that it really does take practice to be a good storyteller. I'm sure a lot of you have a family member who you might avoid at the holidays because you know that they're going to corner you and just start rambling on and on and on. And then you probably also have somebody that you love to talk to because they just, anything they talk about, they can keep you captivated because they're such a good storyteller. So it really does take practice. It really is a skill to be good at using stories. And effective stories have two components. They're usually emotionally compelling and then are well structured. So emotion, I already talked about a little bit. But emotion is going to be using things like values, experiences, and connections. So what do you care about, but then also what do the people you're talking to care about? And I think this is a really important one too, to think about, because a lot of times you know, how many people in here are a science major? Anybody? Okay, so I too was a science major. Sometimes the things that I think are really awesome and cool, the average person isn't as compelled by that factor statistic because they don't have a degree in science. That wasn't what their interest is. So sometimes it's really useful to figure out what that person you're going to be talking to, what do you have in common with that person that you can hone in on to make your story more compelling and powerful. And then experiences. What made this real for you? So again, the kind of typical narrative, right, when climate change first came into the media was polar bears and polar bears dying. Your average person just isn't very compelled to take action to save polar bears that they have never seen in their life and probably will never see in their life. But if you can talk about how your family or somebody you know was impacted by flooding, or how this person's community could be impacted, that is going to be a lot more relatable. So a couple really basic things. We always say start with people and stay with people. So again, people relate to humans and the stories of humans much more than they're going to relate when we're talking about animals. And I always get one person in the room that tells me that they like animals more than humans, and it's very possible, it's very true, but again, that would go into knowing the person that you're talking about, and so maybe the animal narrative would work there. But in general, talking about humans is going to be much more powerful. The other big one is focusing on local realities. So again, if you talk about what's happening in your own backyard or in your own community, that's going to, again, resonate a lot more with the person than something that's happening across the globe, because it's just so hard for them to vision and see when it's not right in their own area. And then emphasize solutions. So I think this is a problem that a lot of people run into when talking about things that have to do with environmental justice, climate change. It's a really depressing topic. And you can sit there and tell a really sad story, but then if you leave a person, if the person gets left feeling really upset and doom and gloom, they're not going to be compelled to take action. You really need to make sure that these stories aren't just all of the depressing facts at once, but that there is a reason for that person to leave the conversation with you with a little bit of hope. And I'll get into that more specifically in a minute. And so we generally recommend this 4-part structure. And this is really a story that's meant for getting somebody to take action. And so the beginning of the story would start with where we are now. So that doesn't mean what's happening right now in this exact room, but something that has happened recently. Generally, you want your story to be something that has happened in the past or is happening right now, not something that maybe could possibly happen in the future. Because again, it's just going to be so much more compelling if it's something that you can see, people can see with their own eyes, not just the future possible potential of something happening. Next, you go on to how did we get here? So what were the choices that society made to get us to this point? Or what was the reasoning that whatever you're talking about happened? These are your this half of the story is your opportunity to talk about sad and depressing and horrible things. When you move into the second half of your story, you really want to take that arc back up and end with kind of a positive and action-oriented note. So where are we trying to go? What is your vision for a more just future? What do you want to see happening? And then how do we get there? So what is that action that you want the person to take that you're communicating with? Is it to get them to go to the Climate Reality Leadership Core training with you? Is it to get them to sign a petition? Is it to get them to go to a march with you? But you really want to end with one solid ask. And I think that's what a lot of people forget when it comes to storytelling, when you're kind of trying to use it for action, is that very, very important last step of making sure you end with an ask. Does this more or less make sense? I think it's pretty simple. I'm going to give you my example story quickly, but then we actually have worksheets for all of you that have this framework laid out on it. And we're going to give you a few minutes to work on your own stories, and then hopefully we'll also have some time for some people to share their stories. And then myself and Alora and Emery in the back can wave her hand too. We can walk around and help all of you if you have any questions. Does that make sense? Awesome. Okay, so as they're passing them out, I can do my example story for you. So I actually went to graduate school in Idaho. And the school I went to was the University of Idaho, which is way up in the Panhandle, about 2 hours from Canada. And the summer I was there, this is an actual screenshot, it was 106 degrees. Average temperatures in that area in the summer should be closer to the 80s, not 106. What was worse than that is while that's usually what it looked like out my window, that is what it looked like. Our entire community was surrounded by wildfires, and all of that was blowing in. Now, why was this such a problem for me? Well, I actually have asthma. And so I lived in a community that was not prepared for really hot weather. I was a grad student. I lived in an apartment that did not have air conditioning. And this is what it looked like outside, so I had to keep all of my windows shut while it was 106 degrees outside. And how did we get here? Well, we got here from fossil fuels that are causing problems like these increases in temperatures, the dying off of trees that's causing our wildfires to increase. And where are we trying to go? So this is what I wanted my town and continue to want this town in Idaho to look like on a summer day. A beautiful place where you can go outside, where there's nice weather, where nobody has to be concerned about not having air conditioning, about the air that they're trying to breathe. And so how do we get there? So the big one is we take action, but even more important for today's talk is that we write about it. So this is an actual blog post that I wrote about this exact thing that was happening in Idaho at the time. And today my ask for all of you is for all of you to also start writing your stories and work on practicing them. And so that was like a very quick story. Your story doesn't always have to be that quick. It definitely is going to be circumstantial. But again, the general arc of the story is there, where you want to, as I said, start with kind of the negatives, what's happening, and then move your way through so that you start talking about positives and then end with what you want people to
do. 2 wonderful young ladies who are doing activism and environmental work on their campuses to share with you all about some of the work they're doing and to get your feedback and hopefully, like I said, spark something in you to continue the work here on Duke. So I'm going to bring Emery forward.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Laura. Again, my name is Emery Kiefer, and I'm Climate Reality's Campus Core Program Coordinator. The Campus Core is a section of Climate Reality chapters, which are located all across the United States to encourage activism in their communities, and specifically for our campus students who are taking action on campus. So we have 2 Campus Core chapters in North Carolina specifically, one at NC State and one at UNC, so it looks like Duke has some catching up to do. But there's also a really lovely coalition here that will definitely talk more about what's happening. And just to get started, I want to quickly introduce our panelists who are going to be here today. We have 2 really excellent students. First, I want to introduce Ariyani Challapalli. Ariyani is a junior majoring in environmental science and policy and minoring in Spanish at Duke University. In her first year at Duke, she initiated research on a reusable takeout container program for students as an intern for Sustainable Duke. For the past 2 years, she served as the president of the Duke Climate Coalition and has played a large role in organizing a campaign to successfully lobby the Duke University to halt the proposed natural gas plant. So let's welcome her to the stage. Great, and our other student is also a soon-to-be alumnus of NC State. Her name is Meredith Bain, and she's the chapter chair of the Climate Reality Campus Corps chapter at North Carolina State University, where she organizes students in campaigns to reduce the university's carbon footprint by changing the way the administration purchases electricity, constructs buildings, and invests in its endowment. After learning from local leaders about the environmental injustices in vulnerable communities that face NC, she designed and executed an educational spring break trip focusing on the human consequences of North Carolina's energy infrastructure projects that future engineering and policy leaders may want to learn more about. Last summer, Meredith combined her passion with environmental protection with her interest in mathematics and German studies by working with the government in Ingolstadt, Germany, where she designed a computer-based system for estimating the city's greenhouse gas emissions. So let's welcome her to the stage as well. All right, and just to kick things off for this panel, I want to start by asking both of you what really brought you into this movement, specifically in climate justice, and what type of work have you done here on campus or off campus?
So I'm from Reno, Nevada, and there's a lot of mountains around that area and just a lot of nature. And so growing up there, I was really interested in protecting that and all of those landscapes, but I didn't really have an opportunity to get involved in it until I came to Duke and realized all of the resources that there are to learn about activism and to get involved in it. And on campus, in my first year, I was an intern for Sustainable Duke, and so I worked with dining to reduce takeout container waste. But then I became the president of Duke Climate Coalition the following year, and it was a really interesting time to be at Duke as an environmental student because Duke had just announced that it was going to be building a natural gas plant with the technology combined heat and power. And along with that, there were also other complications about introducing biogas potentially as a source of energy for that. And so there were just a lot of new discussions about that and what that would mean. And after doing some of my own research and talking to other people that were in Duke Climate Coalition, we decided as an organization that we were against the plant, and we started a campaign to lobby Duke University to at least have a transparent review process on it before going forward. And so that's mainly how I've gotten involved. And in terms of community involvement, I'd say that the plant really was a form of community involvement as well, because biogas affects communities in eastern and western North Carolina where biogas affects pollution rates there. And then also the natural gas plant is just a really big issue for community members and nonprofit organizations in North Carolina who are affected by energy decisions here.
Cool. And I got involved in the environmental movement in general when Emory recruited me for the Climate Reality Project Campus Corps at NC State. And I sort of like to think of the environmental movement as like a gateway issue for people like me who have had like pretty easy lives. And then you start to realize that the same attitude that lets a lot of people, exploit the environment is the same one that lets us exploit animals, laborers, and oppress women and minorities. So you kind of get drawn into this climate justice aspect of it as well. So that's sort of what happened to me. We started out running a campaign called 100% Committed at NC State, where we were trying to get them to go 100% renewable electricity by the year 2030. But we ended up making a proposal where they could sort of arrange virtual power purchase agreements with renewable energy providers to sort of offset and effectively have a 100% renewable electricity generation in the near future. But as I was doing that, I got to know a bunch of students in the community and on campus who were really involved with climate justice issues. And that's when I started getting really interested in energy infrastructure issues and the injustices that accompany them in North Carolina. So we talked a lot about the Atlantic Coast Pipeline in the panel before. And there's also been other issues like Duke Energy's coal ash pollution, not just the spill of 39,000 tons of coal ash in the Dan River, but also the ambient water pollution that's happening in a lot of areas around coal-fired power plants. And also, we can't forget about unsustainable biomass, how Enviva is sort of like deforesting a lot of vulnerable community areas in Richmond and Robeson County. So yeah, I just sort of got sucked into all that as well, and yeah, that's how I got here.
Great. And just to kick off a question for both of you to answer, in your opinion, how are students changing the narrative narrative of environmental activism or activism in general?
Okay. Yeah, so I like this question a lot because I think it's always been students who are kind of spearheading activism of any sort. Even if you look back in history, like the French Revolution, a lot of students put the energy and effort and emotional work into making that happen. In the US, students were leading protests against the Vietnam War, and just a couple minutes, like 45 minutes from here in Greensboro, the Woolworth counter sit-in, that was also led by students. So students have always been sort of the impetus for social change in communities. So that's why it's really exciting to be a student in this particular moment in American history where a lot of things are, very concerning. And I think that students are really stepping up. We have all of the students from the Sunrise Movement who contributed to putting the Green New Deal on the national stage. And we have, of course, a bunch of younger students, even the Parkland students who organized the historic March for Our Lives in DC, and who had a lot of success in pushing state and local policies towards better gun control policies.
I also think that students have been really good at asking questions, which is important because I think as a student, it's an interesting role because you don't know everything about every field of expertise in environmental science, and you're still learning about a lot of these topics, but it's still important to be asking questions that then bring up and raise publicity about issues. So, for example, with the natural gas plant here at Duke and biogas issues, there were a lot of students who maybe wanted the natural gas plant to go through and were asking important questions about, well, is natural gas better than some of the steam plants that we have on campus? And I think that regardless of which side you're on that issue, it's really important that students were raising these questions so that we could go to people who knew more about this, and we could do our own research to find questions to these answers. So it wasn't as much of there's one answer, here's what you're learning, here's what you have to take. It was here's an open discussion that we can start as students.
Yeah, I agree. There's definitely 2018 was a great year for student activism in general, and for many of you who already know today, there's a big rally in Raleigh on the Atlantic Coastal Pipeline led by students as well. Great. So Ariyani, I want to just dive a little bit more into what you've done here at Duke, and just off the bat, like what has the response been from students here on Duke in organizing on the natural gas plant?
I think the response has been good, and also it's been good to raise awareness about the issue. I don't think it's that people don't care about environmental issues or that students don't care about it. In fact, I think in general students do, but I think it's that a lot of people didn't even know that this was happening, or they didn't know that the university planned to have biogas energy be coupled with the gas plant. And so I think just raising awareness about these issues through petitions, we had specific photo petitioning events where people could get more involved. Also with writing op-eds and blogs and letters, this could let students be more involved in it so that they could have more of a positive response to it. And also even with students who maybe didn't agree as much with the campaign that we're running, those reactions were still really important to understand how we could improve our messages and how we could improve the arguments that we were making to understand better how to refute those types of arguments.
Yeah, and just as a quick follow-up there, what was the administration's response to when you started running the campaign? What was that like to work with them?
It was interesting to work with the administration, and it was a really valuable experience. And I think that in the beginning, there were definitely some negative responses to why we were asking some of the questions that we were asking and why we were working so hard on this campaign. And then I think that a year into the campaign, there was kind of a turn where we were working more with administration to try to get a transparent review process with stakeholders on the gas plant and on biogas efforts. And then slowly, if working with administrators didn't work as much, we started to draft sign-on letters with the support of community organizations, nonprofit organizations in North Carolina. And so I think that the administration's response wasn't always just one type of response. Depending on what stage we were in the campaign, there were various responses of maybe frustration and then also wanting to work with us. And so it was interesting as a student to see how they reacted to us.
Great. And Meredith, talking more about your campaigns, you've obviously done a lot of work on campus, but then in coalition with a lot of organizations in Raleigh and in the greater Triangle area. So how have you encouraged your chapter to really take things off campus and be a part of the larger climate justice movement in Raleigh?
Yeah, so one of the great things about NC State is that it's like just, 10 minutes away from downtown Raleigh, which is the capital of North Carolina, which is where a lot of, mostly bad stuff goes on regarding our environment. So we do try and collaborate a lot with local community nonprofits like our chapter of the Sierra Club, the Dogwood Alliance, which is an organization that protects southern forests, has a branch in Raleigh, and they like to let us know about stuff like hearings and protests that are going on. And two of my favorite like protests we've done in Raleigh. One was a rate hike hearing against Duke Energy's proposed rate hike. This was back in the fall where they were trying to make ratepayers pay more money to clean up their own coal ash pollution. And we got to work with a bunch of other organizations, like the campaign Fight for 15 was there, as well as the Sierra Club and the Dogwood Alliance. Maybe the Poor People's Campaign was there. Anita, I don't know if I saw you there, but it was a fun time. It's always great to go to a community event and have a bunch of allies come up and talk about why the environment is important to them, and to sort of like tell the people in charge what we believe. And we're students and we're young, and we have a lot more time to live in North Carolina than a lot of North Carolinian officials do, and it's always fun to pull that card and come to protests. And then another one was when the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management was having a hearing in Raleigh to kind of decide whether or not they're going to follow through with the federal proposal to do offshore drilling off the coast of North Carolina. And that one was particularly interesting because we worked with the Sierra Club to just make a massive turnout at this Raleigh hearing. So the policy would really affect communities on the coast, but the only hearing they had in North Carolina was in the capital. So we got to sort of bring a lot of people in from the coast and talk about how the offshore drilling policies would affect them. So that was fun. So we try and put students in public forums where we're talking about the future of energy policy and climate policy and things that will affect the environment in North Carolina.
Yeah, excellent. And just as a quick follow-up to that, and a lot of times youth can be youth washed and be called cute and ignored in those meetings, but what would you say for either of you is the importance of having a youth voice in those forums and speaking directly to elected officials and other decision makers?
I think that it's important to have a youth voice because we have an interesting perspective on a lot of the issues that are going on. And I think that one thing that I learned that was really important was when I first started the campaign, I'm like naturally a very passive person, and I don't really it was hard for me to question authority. But after doing the campaign for a while, we had worked with, not only had we done our own research on combined heat and power, on biogas, and on solar and a lot of other alternative energy solutions, but we had also worked with nonprofits like Sierra Club and the Natural Resources Defense Council, and with their researchers who were able to do even more research. So once we had done all of that and we knew what we were talking about, came to a point where I had to realize that with all of this information, it's okay to speak up and it's okay to use your voice to say the things that you've been doing research on. And that was something that I had to learn because at first I was really scared to question a lot of the people who have been working here for a while and who know probably a lot more about a lot of these issues.
Yeah. So that is a lot of the struggle that we feel when we come to the administration at NC State is they say, oh, you're not an expert on, we're doing work on having them divest the endowment from fossil fuels right now. And they always say like, oh, you have no idea how finance works. Y'all are in your 20s and we're like 1,000 years old and we've worked on Wall Street. So, and the truth is they're right. Like we're never going to be in the space of a semester as fluent with financial terms and as knowledgeable as they are, but we are experts on, having to survive the next 5 or 6 decades in North Carolina and in this country and on this planet where the climate is rapidly changing. So we do have definitely a valid reason to be at the table, to be directing these decisions that they're making, or at the very least to have a voice. So yeah, all you students out there, don't doubt yourselves.
Excellent. And going off of that not doubting yourself kind of mentality, what piece of advice would you give to students that are new to environmental organizing or organizing as a whole, or just want to be more involved with climate justice in North Carolina?
Do you have an answer? I'm still thinking.
Yeah, I guess just like volunteer. I've talked to a lot of people who feel like maybe a little bit hesitant about wanting to get involved because the instinct is that people want to have all the information, like you were saying, before you sort of take a stand. But the order of things doesn't happen. You get all the information and you make a completely 100% perfectly well-informed decision neutrally. What you do is you kind of like listen to your heart and your moral compass and you say like, should I be involved with this? Like, should I be doing something? And then you just dive in, and that's how you develop sort of the expertise and the knowledge. I really didn't know anything about energy policy or finance at all before I noticed that NC State was using their power and the endowment and the way that they use electricity to not be a leader and to not take a stand in the climate struggle. And so that's what made me want to get involved. And then you start talking to people and you learn a bunch of stuff. So the order is not what you think it is. So just get involved as soon as you want.
Yeah, I agree with getting involved. When the way I got involved in this is I was friends with Claire Wong, who's been like a really important mentor to me and has been involved with the natural gas campaign. And literally how she started this entire campaign was she was just sitting in the library in 2016 before I was even a student here, and she had read a Chronicle article about the announcement of the natural gas plant, and then she just wrote an op-ed in return, and from that op-ed there were so many responses to her, and then we started doing faculty sign-on letters, and we started doing student petitioning, and from there everything just kind of kept going. So one little thing that you do, like an op-ed that might not seem like it's a huge deal, really can generate a lot of response. And so just start with anything you think could potentially help.
Absolutely. And when I was a student organizer as well, I felt like I was organizing under the mentality of you are just running at a wall and you don't know when you're going to hit it. And but the fact that you're running is the important part. So now I just want to open it up for some questions. We have about 10 minutes to ask our superstar students that are organizing here in North Carolina. So feel free to raise your hand and ask away.
When writing the op-ed, I'm not sure if the comments were positive or negative, but do you know how maybe you and her responded to those comments, especially because it was so early on and you didn't know too much about it?
In the beginning, there was definitely a mixture of positive and negative comments. So I think there were some faculty members who were positive in their responses, and I think there were some students just directly who responded to her verbally. And I think that there were also a fair number of negative responses partly from administration and partly from people who just disagreed. And I think we kind of chose to take it as we take the positive responses and find the allies that we can to kind of unite publicity about that. And that's what, when I was talking about the faculty sign-on letter, not every faculty member, not every student was going to be on board with what we were trying to do, but you have to get, or not even every nonprofit, but you have to get the people that you can get on your side, because increasing that group of people can increase your overall, just the allies that you have with you.
And just to go off of that, I think people definitely undervalue the media in campaign making, and Meredith has definitely worked on publishing tons of op-eds and LTEs. Do you want to talk more about how that has helped your campaign at State?
Yeah. So I guess, going back to something Ariyani said earlier is that at Duke, a lot of people cared, they just didn't know. At NC State, we sort of run into the problem that most people neither know nor care about these environmental issues. And that's just something that's sort of unique to the culture of NC State that I don't necessarily super understand. But the way that we decided to, so anyway, that's all just to say that we knew that as a campaign, we could never have a huge, successful, massive protest for 100% renewable energy or for divestment. So we had to get a little bit creative with the way we were using our voice. And one way to do that is to submit op-eds to the student newspaper. It's pretty easy to do. So we had a chain of op-eds that we had one out every week when we were doing our renewable electricity campaign. And they would focus on, we had this three major pillars of the plan that we had for the university to offset all of their electricity emissions. And we would sort of just alternate on why each one was a good thing for the university, why it was pursuant to the university's mission statement, and why students should care about it and should get involved. And the publicity generated from that sustained appearance in the campus paper definitely made the chancellor take us a lot more seriously and helped us get our campaign a lot further than it was. And so, yeah, the media can be a great way to project your voice and your campaign's messaging, even when you have like a whole, 35,000 students on campus and maybe 5,000 of them are concerned about the environment. So.
For questions, yes.
I just want to commend both of you because you're doing great work. And my question is, do you ever have anxiety? Because I know you deal with people that don't really care about what you're doing or they're totally against you. How do you deal with that so that you can continue to do the work you're doing? And please do, because I'm amazed.
Thank you. And during my sophomore year, in the spring semester, I had so much anxiety about this entire campaign because that's when it had really come to a head with, we had sent a letter asking the university's president to have a transparent review process on the natural gas plant and on biogas efforts, which to have that process would require delaying the plant, which was a big ask. And so when I was going into meetings with a lot of people who work on biogas or who are working to push forward the plant, I was so anxious because in my mind, I was like, oh, I'm just a student. How am I going to talk to people who have been working on this? And I guess just how I managed it was, obviously I was still anxious when I went to these meetings, but I had obviously I had like good mentors and I had people that were on my side, and I tried to think about those people instead of the people who were against me. And then I also thought about how much work I'd put into it and knowing that I knew what I was trying to talk about and I knew my arguments and I knew that we had a lot of people who were going to be with us, whether or not the people I was directly speaking to were with us.
Yeah, so I guess like speaking about like anxiety you may feel when you're going up against these like massively powerful people on campus who like really could ruin your life, like keep you from graduating maybe if they wanted. But yeah, so my strategy has sort of been to just really cultivate a group of people who really cares about what the campaign is about, and just always going back to why are we doing this, and that sort of quells anxiety a lot to know that we're doing this because NC State is emitting thousands of tons of greenhouse gas emissions into the air, and there's very easy ways that we could not be doing that, and knowing that there's bigger values at play than just like the personal anxiety that you may feel, and also having like your squad of climate friends around you who all believe in the same thing and are sort of nurturing each other that way.
So Ariyani, you mentioned that you felt like the administration was kind of, against you up until a certain point. Can you talk about why you think that switch flipped, or what led to it?
Yeah, so originally when the natural gas plant was announced, there was no like biogas involved with it. It was just the natural gas plant. So Duke University has a campus sustainability committee, which is basically a committee of students, faculty, and administrators that talk about sustainability issues. And so the campus sustainability committee met, and their recommendations were that the gas plant A, should not go forward unless it can be coupled with biogas, and B, there should be a transparent review process with stakeholders before anything goes forward. And so for a while, we were starting to have the beginnings of that stakeholder process, and I think during that period, we were working more with administration, and from there, our goal was to try to work more like with administration, because our goal wasn't to just always be against administration and say like you're making these mistakes. Our goal was to like work with them to create a dialogue about how we could move forward. And so I think that was the point where we started working more with them. But even at that point, there was times when some of the things that we wanted were still slightly or maybe more than slightly against what they wanted. And so there was still a balance of that.
Awesome. So I think we're just about out of time, but I want to throw another pitch in, just like Catherine, about attending our upcoming training in Atlanta, where we'll have a huge youth component and bringing so many students to come together to talk about these issues and then form their own coalitions. So this is a really awesome opportunity to not only learn about the climate crisis and all of its solutions, but also to meet youth just like all of you who are interested in taking action from across the world. So I encourage you to apply and connect with Emily about attending. It's a really impressive and changing experience for a lot of people. So I hope I'll see you there. But I'm going to pass it back. Well, let's give a quick round of applause for our excellent panelists.